Hello and welcome to the May session of the Raising Ambition through Partnership series, A Just Transition and Green Skills. This series, hosted by the NDC Partnership, GIZ, UNDP, and WRI, highlights successful examples of mitigation and adaptation ambition, rising efforts, and emphasizes learning to scale impact across the partnership. The series is a platform for dialogue among NDC partnership members and beyond to expand, deepen, and build upon efforts and expertise related to long-term low emission development strategies and NDC alignment, update, and enhancement. There are four objectives of today's session. First, to explain what a just transition is and what the motivations are for incorporating it in green skills and NDCs. Second, we want to share insights in these areas from the NDC Partnership, WRI, and the ILO. Third, we want to facilitate the exchange of country experiences in integrating just transition and green skill in their NDCs, implementation, updates we have, and ways of enhancement. And finally, to highlight helpful directions going forward and the available support to ensure a just transition. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping notes. First of all, on interpretation. We are pleased to offer interpretation in Spanish and French for this session. If you would like to listen to the webinar in a language other than the default language, which is English, please follow these instructions. At the bottom of your Zoom window, click on the icon that looks like a globe to access interpretation settings. Once you click on the interpretation icon, a pop-up window will appear showing the available languages for interpretation. Select your preferred language from that list. To hear the interpretation clearly, mute the original audio to avoid overlapping sound. You can do this by clicking on the mute original audio option. So we have a chat and Q&A function. Please use that chat function throughout the session to share comments. If you have resources or if you want to engage in other exchange with other participants. We encourage you to introduce yourselves and share your organization or country that you are joining from. If you have questions for the speakers, please use that Q&A function to share those questions. Now on presentation slides and resources, all the materials from today's session, including the PowerPoint and the highlighted resources, will be shared by email following the event. We have a recording for this session, so please note that the session will be recorded for future reference, and it will be shared on the NDC Partnership YouTube channel. By participating in this session, you consent to being recorded. Thank you for your attention on these housekeeping notes. We're very excited to have you join us today, and we hope that you find this session be informative and engaging. If you have any further questions, please feel free to ask that in the chat. So let's now get started. And I want to go with a scene setting on just transition and green skills that bring us today. This session will discuss just transition and green skills. With an increasing number of countries including commitments on just transition and green skills development in their NDCs, this is a timely topic. I look forward to hearing the experiences of our participants today, the panelists, and all of you. The training and education of the global workforce in green skills is one element that is necessary to achieve a just transition and a green economy. An ILO global review on skills for the future of work found that up to 100 million jobs could be created in the transition to a low carbon and a circular economy by 2030. However, some 78 million jobs could be at risk in the absence of adequate skilling and upskilling. We find that most workers concerned would be able to find jobs in the same occupation in another industry within the same country through reallocation. However, nearly 24 million workers are likely to be in occupations where jobs would be lost without equivalent vacancies arising in other industries. So these workers would require substantial reskilling in other occupations. And so an inclusive transition engaging young people, women, and other vulnerable workers and communities in capacity development efforts is going to be integral of the climate ambition, the climate action, which is necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Countries can do much more to prioritize a just transition and green skill development. Therefore, the next round of NDCs for 2025 and the submissions that countries will put forward is an opportunity for countries to prioritize these issues with long-term planning and a sustainable future that will leave no one behind. So I'm therefore very excited to hear from our panelists today and I look forward to hearing from your experiences as well. So our agenda will take us first through having the panelists presenting insights from the ILO, from WRI, and the NDC Partnership, as well as representatives from Vietnam, Colombia, and South Africa that will be showing their experiences in integrating just transition and green skill development in their NDCs. So to get us started, I will hand over to my colleague from the NDC Partnership, Sarah Wolf, to present trends in the request for support from the NDC Partnership, which are related to just transition and green skills. So I'm pleased to turn over to Sarah for her initial presentation.
Thank you, Mustafa. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Wolf. I'm Knowledge Management Associate at the NDC Partnership Support Unit. And today I'll briefly share trends in countries' NDC implementation support needs and gaps in support related to just transition and green skills, sourced from the NDC Partnership's knowledge management system. First, a few words about this system. From our engagement in over 90 countries, the NDC Partnership has amassed information on country needs for support for NDC implementation and enhancement, articulated through more than 6,000 requests for support circulated through the NDC Partnership. We store this information in the Knowledge Nook, or Nook, the partnership's knowledge management system. This information can be used to identify trends in countries' needs for NDC implementation and enhancement support, and to identify outstanding gaps in support. These insights can help partners shape their support offerings. From a preliminary analysis of this data using a few keyword searches related to just transition and green skills development, we can draw out trends in country requests related to just transition and green skills. This preliminary analysis is informing a process that's currently ongoing to create a just transition tag in the Nook, which will allow users to easily extract these real-time trends in country needs going forward. Our preliminary analysis shows that the NDC Partnership has received 69 requests for support explicitly related to just transition and green skills development, representing 1% of all requests received by the partnership. These 69 requests come from 30 countries across all regions, the majority of which are from Latin America and the Caribbean and Sub-Saharan Africa. We dove into the content of these requests according to the NUC's unique tagging structure to identify key trends in countries' NDC implementation needs related to just transition and green skills development. We found that energy, agriculture, and water are the most common sectors reflected in these requests. While over half cut across both mitigation and adaptation, of those with a single focus, mitigation is more common. When looking at the value chain of services, the majority focus on policy, strategy, and legislation. It's interesting to note that none focus specifically on monitoring and evaluation. Countries are still seeking support for 36% of these requests. If we delve deeper into this support gap, we can see that countries need support for just transition and green skills related requests in the buildings, water, agriculture, forestry, and other land use and energy sectors. Requests focused on strengthening technical and institutional capacities have significant gaps in support, with nearly half still seeking support. Requests focused on adaptation and those that cut across both adaptation and mitigation have significant support gaps. Please look out for additional analysis later this summer as we finalize this new just transition tag in our NUC system. I'm excited to hear more from colleagues today about how they think about just transition and green skills development when developing and enhancing their NDCs. Back to you, Mustafa.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that very insightful presentation. Now I turn to Janet Walls from WRI to present draft key findings from WRI's analysis of just transition in countries LT-LEDs and NDCs. Janet, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Mustafa, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. So my name is Jeanette Walls. I'm a research associate on WRI's International Climate Action Team. And as Mustafa mentioned, I'll be speaking briefly on some results from an ongoing analysis that we're doing. Next slide, please. So this research initially began a few years ago and looked at explicit mentions of just transition within NDCs that parties had submitted to the UNFCCC. Our analysis from 2021 found that 41 countries, so 15 parties, including 14 countries plus the 27 EU member states, had included just transition in their NDCs. Analysis for the State of NDCs report that we published in 2022 found that that number had increased, with 59 countries or 33 parties having included just transition in their NDC as of May of that year. And an update to that analysis ahead of COP last year found that the number had increased to 72 countries or 46 parties. So this chart looks at the number of parties to the UNFCCC. So at the end of 2023, there were a total of 46 parties who had explicitly mentioned just transition. And at the bottom, you can see that's the year in which those NDCs were submitted. Next slide, please. So this map shows the change over time. So when countries explicitly included just transition in their NDCs. As you can see, South Africa was the first and only party to include just transition in its intended nationally determined contribution in 2015. But even now, most of this map remains gray, countries who haven't included just transition in their NDC. So in looking at the NDCs and this gray map, and knowing that just transition efforts are happening around the world, we realized that only counting explicit mentions of just transition wasn't capturing the full picture. There are parties who are doing just transition or incorporating what we would consider to be elements of just transition, but not calling it such. So the 2020 NDC of the United States is an example of this. It mentions leaving no one behind, but it never uses the term just transition. And there are other places where countries could be showcasing what they are doing with regards to just transition, namely long-term low emissions development strategies, which I'll call LT-LEDs or long-term strategies. So they're another important place to look when looking at how countries are incorporating just transition into their communications to the UNFCCC. Next slide, please. So for this current ongoing analysis, we're looking not only at explicit mentions of just transition, but also an inclusion of related themes that we've seen in existing just transition literature. Specifically, we've identified the following 3 themes that we interpret as comparable to explicitly mentioning just transition. So supporting vulnerable workers and communities, so no one is left behind in the transition to new green employment, fair work through retraining, skills development, implementing educational tools to expand on these skills, making sure that these new opportunities are inclusive and accessible, including references to decent work or Sustainable Development Goal 8 on decent work and economic growth. The integration and inclusiveness of all populations, especially those most impacted by the transition, with specific attention to equity concerns, so gender, social, intergenerational equity, and forms of justice, distributive, restorative justice, environmental and energy justice, inclusion of youth and or other communities that may be more impacted or vulnerable to the transition, and key aspects of procedural justice and meaningful stakeholder engagement and participation. So dialogue, including social dialogue, participation and engagement between governments and their communities to develop locally driven, place-based, context-specific transitions. And this is all in relation to transition efforts. So many NDCs describe participatory processes for updating their NDCs or gender equality as a national goal, but here we're looking at these issues as tied specifically to, the change elements necessary for transitioning or transforming, within climate action. And not that transition is a linear process by any means, but the visual below shows how we are coding the NDCs and LT-LEDs as we review them. So those that do not mention just transition nor the themes noted above are coded as having no coverage. Those that mention just transition or the above themes in a limited manner are coded as having minimal coverage. The NDCs and LT-LEDs are coded as having moderate coverage when they don't have a full just transition strategy or policy or plan in effect, but make explicit reference to such a mechanism containing these elements that will be enacted or established. And the NDCs and LT-LEDs are coded as having full coverage if they refer to a strategy, policy, law on just transition or these elements that is currently in place. Next slide, please. So of the quantitative analysis of the 151 NDCs we've gone through thus far, what we found is that 29 countries have no coverage, 83 have minimal coverage, 39, so this includes the EU's 27 member states, provide moderate coverage, and no countries have full coverage. Regarding the analysis of the LT-LEDs or the long-term strategies that we've looked at, which includes only those in English thus far, we found 11 LT-LEDs have no coverage, 28 have minimal, 17 provide moderate coverage, and 5 LT-LEDs, and that includes the EU's long-term strategy, which covers 27 EU member states, have full coverage. So building off of the previous slide, one finding that is clear is that the level of detail that NDCs and LT-LEDs are providing on just transition is highly uneven. Some countries and parties are not including just transition or the themes that we consider elements of just transition. Others mention the concept briefly, like in the NDCs of Mauritius and Iceland, while others, such as Costa Rica, South Africa, and Antigua and Barbuda, have paragraphs or dedicated sections on just transition. And similar with long-term strategies. Some mention it briefly, while others have dedicated sections. Next slide, please. And as mentioned earlier, when we are going through these NDCs and LT-LEDs, we're also looking at these different elements with regards to equity and participatory processes and support for those who will be most impacted, and unpacking the different ways that countries are including these issues in these documents. So while this analysis is ongoing, we are seeing some patterns in how countries or parties are talking about just transition and related elements within these documents. For example, when talking about just transition, most of the documents are focused on the energy sector, but there are some countries that are focused on agriculture, like Belize notes in its long-term strategy, or forestry, like in Liberia's NDC. Most of the specific focus that we're seeing with regards to equity is focused on gender equality, intergenerational equity, and youth inclusion. Many countries are also including information on skilling or training in their workforces. Antigua and Barbuda's NDC, for example, includes the target of 100% of the affected parts of the national workforce trained to use new mitigation technologies for a low greenhouse gas emissions transition. And there are also mentions of green jobs. And while that's not fully defined in the documents, that inclusion is important when thinking about the economic diversification options that countries will need to explore for their transition. Nigeria's NDC, for example, specifically notes how it's focusing on green jobs by diversifying the economy, and diversification of the economy and growth in non-oil revenue are essential to job creation by MSMEs, especially for youth. We hope this analysis supports countries in sharing their experiences with regards to incorporating just transition into their NDCs, long-term strategies, and even their national policies and plans. We're all at different points in this transition, and understanding what's been focused on thus far and sharing these learnings can hopefully help to strengthen efforts to ensure that these transitions are just. Thank you so much. Back to you, Mustafa.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, for this very insightful presentation and sharing the results of this quantitative analysis. Just a reminder to everyone that if you have questions for the panelists, the speakers, please use the Q&A chat function. So I now turn to Camila Roman from the ILO to present key findings and emerging trends from ILO's Just Transition Mapping Analysis and case studies on the integration of Just Transition in LT-LEDs and NDCs. Over to you, Camila.
Thank you, Mustafa, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here today. I already listened to some really useful insights. Next slide, please. In the course of the next 5-10 minutes, I'll give you a short overview of a work stream of the ILO that pertains the integration of Just Transition in NDC. And this global work stream complements our country level support. The goal of this work stream is to generate and share knowledge for addressing Just Transition in NDCs and their implementation through a series of key products and projects. One is a baseline and mapping that we are conducting in collaboration with EPFL. The second is a set of case studies. And the third is some upcoming practical guidance. We hope to do all of this in collaboration and partnerships, and I cannot imagine a better platform than today's meeting to really reach out and see how we can work together in order to have to maximize our impacts. And I already heard some about some really interesting initiative and pieces of work that could come into this space very well. If we move on to the next slide. These are some key elements of the mapping that we are conducting. The objective of the mapping complement and is quite similar to what Jeanette has been sharing in the exercise of WRI, and I see some great complementarities. The idea there is provide insights on the state of play regarding the uptake of Just Transition in NDCs. But also to establish a baseline for upcoming NDC revisions. In terms of scope, we are looking at a few elements. The first one is Just Transition depth. So how Just Transition is articulated in the policy document. The second one is looking at the second aspect of Just Transition depth is the extent to which there are follow-up actions envisaged, references to finance and references to international cooperation. The second pillar is looking at policy areas and issues related to Just Transition, how they've been addressed and integrated in the NDCs. And the third is zooming into some specific policy areas, and we will start with skills and education. The framework of analysis we use is based on the ILO Just Transition guidelines that also inform the set of questions for each corresponding variable. The exercise is ongoing, and we right now we cover 64 countries, and we expect to complete all countries in the next 4 to 5 months. So in the next slides, you will see some elements of the findings that should not be seen as representative, but is more to give you a flavor of what we're going to be covering. Here you get a sense of how different policy areas are receive different types of coverage, and seeing a high incidence of macroeconomic and growth policies or sectoral policies, and then a lower incidence of, for example, occupational health and safety. If we move on to the next slide, we also get a sense of what target groups are associated to a Just Transition. Again, here what's interesting is that it's still less than 25% that specify certain groups, for example, women, in the context of Just Transition. It doesn't mean that there's no attention to groups in situations of vulnerability of disadvantage, but here we're talking about specific references. But also when we compare different groups, we see that, for instance, there's a lot less references in relation to Just Transition when it comes to the elderly or small-scale farmers as compared to women and youth. If we then move on to the next slide, I will talk a little bit about the case studies that we've conducted on the integration of Just Transition in NDC, LT-LEDs, and NAPs. The goal here is to have a more in-depth analysis of country cases, and we looked at Costa Rica, Indonesia, South Africa, and Spain. We hope to add a couple of more. With the objective of provide some reflections that can inform the update, the enhancing of the new rounds of NDCs, but also to foster dialogue around this in contexts such as today, but also as part of the upcoming Just Transition work program dialogue that will happen in Bonn very shortly. And this was indeed an ILO submission. If we move on to the next slide. There's different aspects that we are covering in this in-depth case studies, and I think it also reflects some of the elements that Jeanette highlighted in their own exercise of mapping. The first is how just transition is reflected in the policy document. The second is what policy areas are given particular attention. And the third is what kind of mechanisms of policy dialogue and arrangements for policy coordination are envisaged. If we move on to the next slide, I will give some overall reflections that emerge from this analysis. And what we are seeing is that there is a clear understanding of just transition has been both about positive and negative impacts. That the notion of and logic of leaving no one behind is no surprise, but is really integral to the to just transition references in the NDCs. And that just transition is both in the context of adaptation and mitigation, even though it's further articulated in the context of mitigation so far, but not in terms of applicability. It's also understood as applicable to adaptation, although in a, let's say, more seminal form. Employment consideration are an important aspect of just transition, and they're very clearly recognized. Sectoral perspective matter, but it goes beyond energy, and I think it's quite clear that there are a number of sectors that are highlighted in relation to just transition. Just transition is largely consider a cross-cutting issues in these climate policy documents, but several countries go beyond the general commitments and translate this into an actual embedding in actions. And I think this is a quite important point, either in specific measures that are outlined throughout the NDCs, or through dedicated just transition related actions, such as the establishment of a framework, of a plan, of a certain governance arrangements. Just transition, social dialogue and stakeholder engagement are recognized in several instances as fundamental to just transition as part of the process aspects of things. If we then turn up to the next slide, to perhaps make it easy to remember, some learnings that we have extracted here could be summarized as a delta scheme. So just transition is about decent work, but it's also about the distribution of benefits and costs of climate actions. It has an essential point that relates to diversity, equality, and inclusion. And in terms of process, it has to be based on dialogue that helps to build broad-based supports on sound diagnostics and assessments, and to drive implementation to have concrete actions. And in the next slide. And so that's really a kind of thinking that is informing our support at the country level, that ranges from employment and social impact assessments to facilitation of social dialogue, to support to policy development and implementation and capacity development. So very eager to hear the rest of the session and insights that can help foster our knowledge. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Camilla, for that very insightful presentation on the ongoing mapping and the insights in going forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, we now move to a second part, if you like, of our discussion, where we will hear the experiences from countries on integrating green skills and just transition into their NDC implementation, update, and enhancement. So we will hear from Vietnam, Colombia, and South Africa. So first of all, I'm pleased to invite Mr. Dinh Tai Hong from Vietnam to share Vietnam's experience. Over to you, sir.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ding Tai Hung, and I'm in-country facilitator of NDC Partnership. I'm very happy to have this chance today to sharing our experience in Vietnam in integrating just transition and green skills into the nationally determined contributions in Vietnam. Next slide, please. Yes, as you may know that Vietnam have developed the initial NDC in 2020, updated NDC in 2022, and now we are on the way in preparation for the NDC 2.0 is planned to submit to 2025 next year. And we can see that Vietnam is a developing country, and we are facing with some very difficulty and challenges in our socio-economic development. On the other hand, we also would like to raise our awareness and move forward to have a target of the net zero commitment target in 2050, which is the Vietnamese government have very challengingly ourselves to put the target in the Paris Agreement and in COP26. So in the development of NDC, we have already, considered about the target that we have to achieve, or we're looking forward to achieve it in greenhouse gas emission reduction, as well as improve our capacity in climate change adaptation. So in NDC updated in 2022, we have a scenario to make our effort and achievement in greenhouse gas emission reduction. We also have to put our effort to the policy framework supporting and focusing on the greenhouse gas emission reduction measure in sector. And here, if you look at to the graph above on the slide, we can see that our achievement that we are developing the scenario with the unconditional contribution and under the conditional contribution. And we can see that all of the 5 sectors, energy, agriculture, LULUCF, waste, industry process, also have to find the way to reduce, to cut off the greenhouse gas emission. And with the developing country like in Vietnam, we're facing with a lot of difficulties. And one of the most difficulties in implementing any climate change adaptation and mitigation policy is how to integrate the just transition into the process, as well as providing green skills to the human resource that to have a full capacity to approach with a new opportunity in the future. Next slide, please. Yes, and this is how that we are integrating the just transition and green skill. Firstly, for the transition, with the purpose that left no one behind, we would like to call for the contribution and participation from all the stakeholders in the society, especially focusing on the vulnerable community. So that's why this is the first time that the Vietnamese government developed the National Steering Committee to implement the commitment for Vietnam in COP26. This is organization led by the Prime Minister with the participation and actively contribution from ministry and agency. So it means that all the activity, especially for the development of the strategy and plan in every sector, also have to integrate the climate change adaptation and mitigation strategy. And of course, we understand that all the development of the central or the provincial level, the local level in socio-economic development also have to consider about the climate change topic. And on the other hand, we would like to call for the participation and contribution of the social organizations to take part to the climate change adaptation and mitigation. And for the green skill, we can see that with the cross-cutting development in the institution and legislation complement, this is understandable that the green skill should be considered, and we work directly between the Ministry of Natural Resource Environment and the Ministry of Labor, Invalid, and Social Affairs to find out the classification of the green skill and providing the green skill into the technical vocational education and trainings for the new human resource, as well as for the people who are facing with the problem of the unemployment in the near future. So this is important to call for the contribution and financial resource from all the stakeholders. We understand that Vietnam could not do it by ourselves. We're searching for the international financial resource collaboration. We're also looking for the financial support of private sector who would like to have more chance and opportunity to do the business in the green field. And of course, we encourage the private investment, especially in energy efficiency and renewable energy development. To ensure the just transition, we have to including the support of the people who lost the jobs and creating a new job, assist low-income groups when energy prices are high, and protect the woman's right. And of course, we put a lot of effort in innovate the energy sector, especially for the renewable energy. And we would like to improve the living standard to have a better resilient capacity and adaptive capacity for nature, for economic, and for social system. Next, please. And under the process of the NDC implementation, we have the number of the activity which is financed by the international collaboration agencies from the bilateral and multilateral collaboration, international collaborations. And we also have the number of the program applied by using the public financial from the government. Here, this is two pictures that I'd like to introduce to you, some result of some project, some identical project that we have had in the few years recent. The new training programs on renewable energy have been developed with hundreds of trainers have been involved and supporting the program. This is a very successful program organized under the support of the Germany government and organized and implemented under the collaboration between GIS and the Vietnamese authorities. And in the agricultural, we understand that Vietnam is still pay attention and focusing on the agricultural activity. So green agriculture and forestry with the reduction of the fertilizer, water use, and energy saving and energy efficiency with the topic of the environmental protection also provide to the farmer a number of opportunity to apply the knowledge on of the green skill to their daily work. Next, please. And of course, focusing on the technical and vocational education training, we have a number of the training program, which is very, very close to the topic that Vietnam are trying to develop in the near future. This is the renewable energy, especially for the solar energy, for the wind energy, and other renewable energy resource that can help Vietnam to decarbonize our system. And the educational curriculum and training program materials have developed not only by the training organizations, but also the university to develop the new human resource for the new future. Next, please. And recently, this is very good initiative that Vietnam have started to mobilize the financial resource is for just transition in NDC implementation. The political declaration on establishing the Just Energy Transition Partnership with Vietnam have already now launched between Vietnam and international partner group and GFANZ. And the resource mobilization plan implementing Vietnam Just Energy Transition Partnership have already launched in COP28 to have the first milestone for Vietnam in helping Vietnam to deliver the pathway to net zero emission and identifying a set of priority policy actions and regulation reform to develop an enabling environment for investment to boost renewables and reduce reliance on fossil fuel. It also identified priority investment projects in JETP-related area and includes the building blocks for a framework to analyze and monitor the just aspect of the energy transition with the ultimate objective to leave no one behind in the green transition. This is, I think it's still early to talk about the result of the integrating NDC implementation with just transition and skill in Vietnam. But we have steps to step forward and to make it real in Vietnam in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Din Tai Hong, for sharing the experience of Vietnam. I think this is already very comprehensive framework, with the inclusiveness and the interdepartmental collaboration that you have highlighted, which are all very important. So we now turn to Colombia, and I invite Andres Armando Arevalo Amaya, who will speak on Colombia's experience.
Hi everyone. Okay, the presentation is in English, but I'm doing it in Spanish. Ok, bueno, permítame me presento, mi nombre es Andrés Arevalo. Yo soy parte del Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible, pertenezco a la Dirección de Cambio Climático y Gestión del Riesgo. Además, soy parte del equipo negociador en el programa de trabajo de transición justa. Permítame comenzar la presentación comentándoles cómo está actualmente estructurada nuestra NDC. La última actualización que tuvimos de esta se realizó en el año 2020 y esperamos lanzar una nueva versión, un documento actualizado en el año siguiente, en el 2025, en el cual vamos a tener como ítem integrador la transición justa. Actualmente nuestra NDC se compone de 237 medidas y metas, las cuales están divididas en 124 metas a nivel nacional, 89 metas a nivel territorial y 24 metas correspondientes al sector privado. Dentro de las 124 metas a nivel nacional, estas se encuentran siendo lideradas por diferentes carteras ministeriales aquí en Colombia. Es decir, el Ministerio de Minas y Energía estableció unas metas de acuerdo a sus condiciones, el Ministerio de Trabajo lo hizo de igual forma, y así cada ministerio estableció sus metas y fueron integradas dentro de la NDC. De igual forma, a nivel territorial, aquí en Colombia, nuestro país se divide por departamentos y cada departamento está dirigido por gobernaciones. Es así que cada gobernación, cada departamento estableció también unas metas de acuerdo a las condiciones que tenían establecidas. Todo ello pues para un total de 237 metas y medidas. Las temáticas de estas metas y medidas están enfocadas en el aumento de áreas de conservación o áreas restauradas, en la reducción de hectáreas en deforestación, en la conversión a ganadería sostenible, en la conversión a sistemas agropecuarios sostenibles, en la generación de kilovatios generados con energías renovables y ahorrados, por estrategias de eficiencia energética, medidas enfocadas a la movilidad sostenible, a la incorporación de vehículos eléctricos e híbridos, a la reducción de residuos sólidos y residuos reciclados y transformados. Siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Next, next slide, please. Ok, como venía comentándolo, nuestro propósito es integrar el ítem de transición justa en, en la actualización de nuestra nueva NDC. Y para garantizar la incorporación de la transición justa en esta actualización, en esta nueva versión de la NDC, nosotros hemos apostado por incorporar la transición justa como un marco integrador en dos aspectos. Uno de ellos es a través del portafolio climático que nuestro presidente estableció, lanzó en la pasada COP28 en Dubái. Este portafolio Este portafolio está integrado por cinco apuestas. Una de ellas es el turismo de la naturaleza, otro es el de sistemas productivos sostenibles y la economía de la biodiversidad, otro es el de conservación y reforestación de ecosistemas y finalmente tenemos el de transición energética justa. Adicional a ellos, Adicional a ellos, tenemos un quinto componente que es el de justicia climática, que es transversal a estos cuatro que ya mencioné. Y nosotros correlacionamos la justicia climática con la transición justa a través de unas condiciones habilitantes, que son lineamientos estratégicos de paz y acción climática de Colombia. En Colombia fueron construidos unos lineamientos para garantizar que el enfoque de paz y derechos humanos sean incluidos dentro de esta nueva versión de la NDC. Son básicamente 5 lineamientos estratégicos que se han convertido en las condiciones habilitantes para lograr que el componente de justicia climática se viabilice y la transición justa también. Em, entonces tenemos 5 lineamientos y por cada lineamiento pues tenemos una serie de recomendaciones técnicas que deben seguir los proyectos que se que se establecieron dentro de este portafolio de acción climática que mencionaba anteriormente, para garantizar que el enfoque de transformación y transición justa se viabilice y se materialice en cada una de las etapas del proyecto. De esta manera nos da una base para establecer las nuevas metas y medidas de paz y transición justa que van a ser incluidas dentro de nuestra nueva versión de NDC. Además, como lo mencionábamos, llamamos a la transición justa como un marco integrador porque no solo integramos los proyectos del portafolio de acción climática, sino que también integra los enfoques transversales como lo vemos arriba, los enfoques transversales de paz, derechos humanos, un enfoque intergeneracional, porque va a tener la priorización de niños, niñas y adolescentes, un enfoque étnico que incluye las comunidades indígenas y afrodescendientes, y un enfoque territorial que lo realizaremos a través de la comunicación que tendremos a través de las mesas de participación en el territorio, que ya les explicaré. Entonces, es así como estamos formulando el marco de la transición justa dentro de la actualización de la NDC. En este año, pues estamos desarrollando la formulación y el desarrollo de estas mesas, en donde equipo del gobierno realizará mesas de trabajo en donde involucremos esos aspectos, como mencionaba. Los proyectos que se formularon en el portafolio de acción climática, que fueron establecidos por diferentes carteras ministeriales acá en Colombia, y que a su vez integren estos enfoques transversales que les mencionaba, de paz, derechos humanos, enfoque intergeneracional, enfoque étnico y enfoque territorial. Y todo esto para que al final estas metas y medidas, estas nuevas metas y medidas tengan esta integración a través de la transición justa. Siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Siguiente slide. Next slide, please. Ok, y esto es, pues, ¿cómo lo vamos a lograr? ¿Cómo vamos a realizar este enfoque de participación territorial y esta inclusión de la transición justa dentro de nuestra actualización? Durante este año realizaremos unas mesas de trabajo en el territorio con ecorregiones que hemos determinado y priorizado aquí dentro de Colombia, y unas mesas étnicas también que involucre a las comunidades indígenas y a las comunidades afrodescendientes. Em, Estas ecorregiones pues contarán con la participación de actores de gobierno territorial y actores de la sociedad civil que allí prioricen, y, y aquí que el gobierno se desplazará a cada uno de estos territorios, pero también tendremos mesas de participación sectorial, entiéndase sectorial por carteras ministeriales, trabajadas aquí en Bogotá, en la capital de Colombia, en la cual también miraremos la integración de los componentes que aquí les presento en la diapositiva. Tendremos mesas en estas mesas participativas, tendremos
Mr.
submesas
Areval,
donde se trabajan
I'm sorry interrupting, but I realized that we're somehow running out of time and we still have to go to hear from South Africa. So if I may ask to wrap up, please, and we will be sharing all the slides with all participants. Thank you for your understanding.
Ya, perdón. No, ya esto era para finalizar, es cómo lo vamos a realizar, como les decía, a través de mesas de participación a nivel territorial y a nivel sectorial, en donde el equipo del gobierno del Ministerio de Ambiente está vigilando la incorporación de justicia climática, transición justa, como lo mencionaba anteriormente, con los enfoques transversales, los proyectos, para que se dé de esta forma integradora. Muchísimas gracias.
Well, thank you so much. That's fantastic. It was very helpful to hear the experience of Colombia, and we will share the slides as well. Thank you so much, sir. So I now turn to Divan Pillay from South Africa to hear South Africa experience. So over to you.
Thank you, Mustafa. And good afternoon to everyone from South Africa. Mustafa, I just want to preface my the presentation, but just a high-level view of the Presidential Climate Commission, so it helps contextualize the presentation better. The Presidential Climate Commission was established by the President of South Africa to advise government on the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. In doing this, we largely try to build a consensus among all stakeholders, and based on that consensus, advise government. But much of this advice is actually based on scientific research that's evidence-based, so government is able to take informed decisions with regards to the transition. Next slide, please. So broadly, we tend to agree in terms of green jobs and what it contributes to. It speaks largely to preserve and restore the environment. It speaks about the green sectors, particularly the new sectors, renewable energy, energy efficiency, etc. But we try to shy away from using the term green jobs too often because it kind of creates a skewed perspective and a skewed view at times, where people in our consultations see green jobs limited to environmental issues only. And we envisage the just transition to be a cross-cutting initiative across all sectors of society, across all sectors of the economy. It's enmeshed in all activities that are taking place. The just component of the transition has become very critical in South Africa and has become the main policy thrust in most of the activities by government, by the private sector, by the trade unions and civil society. Next slide, please. So the just transition framework, provides the policy basis for the transition in South Africa. Amongst others, it speaks to, skills development being centered towards the transition. Distributive and restorative justice is given effect largely by enhancing skills for the new workers, as well as workers that are at risk. We see skills development holistically. It's not specifically linked to a particular sector or a particular sector of the economy, but rather across economic sectors, what's required for a climate resilient economy. And skills are then geared accordingly. Reskilling and upskilling of workers most at risk is a very critical component of the just transition. And what this means is aligning the skills development system within South Africa towards the future labor market and towards the future labor force. Now, I'll speak to this in a bit, and I'll give you a little bit more detail on that. We mentioned green jobs because we think that's where a lot of opportunities will originate as part of new sectors of the economy. A lot of work has been done in this. So green jobs become central to particular activities in terms of the envisaged new economy. But in terms of developing these skills, it doesn't just start at the point you enter the labor market. We're now thinking of this much broader. We're looking at building in the entire just transition within the schooling curricula. So you're able to, at a tertiary level or at a secondary schooling level, begin to build an understanding of this transition and get people and get youth geared towards this transition and interested in the new opportunities that will eventually emerge. Could I move to the next slide, please? So what we envisage here that's taking place is actually a major revolution. South Africa has had chronic unemployment, excessively high levels of up to 36%. We've had extremely high levels of poverty. In the past 30 years, notwithstanding several innovative policies being introduced, we failed to make a significant impact in terms of unemployment and poverty. So we envisage this new transition to actually deal with this. So we look at South Africa currently, which we are highly vulnerable to climate change. We have low productivity. We have a weak public sector where implementation is very poor. We have extreme levels of inequality and poverty, high levels of unemployment, decreasing per capita income, but we also have a strong social base laid for the just transition. Through this transition, which is three-pronged. One is the decarbonization, that's shifting the economy to a low-carbon net zero economy by 2050. We're looking at adaptation and resilience being a key factor. And when we speak about adaptation and resilience, we're looking at how existing sectors of the economy needs to adapt, how society needs to adapt. In resilience, we're looking at how do we deal with this from an environmental perspective. And within that itself, there's a whole host of opportunities linked to new jobs to be created. So adaptation and resilience become a very critical component of this transition. And lastly is the just transition, and the just component is most important. We speak to how do you transition people from current jobs that will be lost to new jobs. In this regard, we speak about transitioning in and transitioning out. So transitioning out will be those jobs that will be lost, and transitioning in refers to jobs that will be created. So we look at the economy, and we look at the sectors of the economy where this is impacted, and then develop appropriate strategies and policies. Now, leaving no one behind is engraved, enmeshed, imbued in all the work that we do. So it's not just workers and communities, it's all of society. So it includes youth, it includes academic environment, it looks at the schooling environment, it looks at the workplace. So it's an entire transition. So we want to move towards an economy and society that is resilient to climate risks. We want to have a net zero carbon economy. We want to grow investments, increase GDP. We want to have an effective state. And we want to dramatically reduce inequality, unemployment, and poverty by 2050. All of this must be done in a socially inclusive and just manner. Next slide, please. So in the just transition framework, 4 sectors were flagged as those most at risk. Collectively, we're estimating to lose around 500,000 plus jobs. But at the same time, we're expecting to create a larger quantity of jobs through other sectors, new sectors that will emerge and growing existing sectors. So often what we find is when people speak about the just transition in South Africa, it's often very skewed to Mpumalanga, because Mpumalanga is where most of the coal mines are located. This is where most of the power stations are located. And just in 2 districts in Mpumalanga is completely dominated by coal. There is very little other economic activity taking place there outside of coal mining and energy generation. So when we look at when we look at these sectors at risk, we look at what is it that needs to happen towards economic diversifications of those areas most at risk. So as part of the PPCC's mandate, we began to implement this initiative. It's a partnership model initiative. That's a bottom-up approach that brings all stakeholders together to identify these opportunities. And in identifying these opportunities is what leads to identification of the skills for the future. So, in South Africa, we have an extensive skills ecosystem, but we still have an ongoing argument put forward by the private sector that we're not creating sufficient skills. So that ecosystem needs to change. And I'll just quickly speak to that in the next slide. But in terms of this slide, these are the jobs and these are the sectors that need to transition and need to transition very quickly. So coming to the skills formation system, you could see there's a number of players, and I apologize for all of the acronyms, but a number of them are actually state institutions such as the HDRC, which is the Human Development Resource Council, the National Skills Authority, Sector Education and Training Authorities. These are all state institutions that provide the supply side for skills. The demand side is the private sector, and they work with SETAs to identify the skills that's required so that the skills can be produced. Unfortunately, somewhere in that system, there's a disjuncture where we have huge quantities of skilling taking place, huge resources that's spent, but it's still not meeting the needs of the private sector. So this ecosystem that I'm speaking through to you now is something that we're tweaking, and we need to rechange and readjust and re-innovate towards addressing the just energy transition and contributing to the just energy transition, particularly from a skills ecosystem. Can we move to the next slide? And I'm going to now speak to some of the initiatives that are underway. Now, this is just some of the initiatives. There's a plethora of research that's taken place that I've not mentioned, and a number of practical implementations that's taken place. So firstly, based on the just transition framework, we're identifying economic diversification opportunities. Linked to those economic diversification opportunities, we're identifying occupations, the skills that are required for those occupations, and then skilling for those occupations directly. So you have a direct input from skills into jobs. From the just energy transition side, we have identified 3 focused areas. One is hydrogen, the second is renewable energy, and the third is new energy vehicles. For each of these, we've been establishing a skills economic zone and a skills development zone. This will specifically speak to what are the skills required for these specific industrial activities. And most of these are new activities. Hydrogen is nascent in South Africa. It's taking off. There's a lot of plans in place. There's a few plans that's been established, but it's still a huge sector that needs to grow. On the NEV sector, while we have a massive auto sector, there's the transition to the new energy vehicles and the skills required for that, and the skill sets and occupations required still needs to be clearly identified and marked. We also picked that as we transition and we shift away from coal to renewables, this has opened up the market for new entries into energy generation. Energy generation previously was controlled by the state through a company called Eskom. Now, with the new opportunities that are emerging with the private sector, it changes the entire value chains within the energy system. So previously, you had Eskom supplying local government then providing the electricity to the private sector and to households.
I'm just going to ask to wrap up. I'm mindful of time.
Sure.
I think it's very insightful, but yeah, we'll need to bring this to a close.
Okay, just a minute more. So there's a transition going on where you need to have the state capacitated to be able to adjust and move to this new energy skills pipeline. The work that's taking place is such as skills mapping across the entire country, across the various provinces. We're looking at workers that's most at risk, particularly in the mining and auto sector, and identifying what new occupations they can shift to. We're looking at skills pathways that are being developed, and some initiatives such as Power Up, which is matching skills that are required by the economy directly with academic institutions. So once again, you get the direct throughput. Chair, I'm not going to go through the next slide. That just speaks to some of the initiatives that the PCC is working through, and colleagues can have a look at that. And then, if there's any issue, then they can just raise it with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So, and again, we will share the presentations with all participants. So apologies for the interaction, but it has been very insightful to hear from Vietnam, Colombia, and South Africa. So we're ending this part of the discussion, and I'm just wanting to, so this was Mustafa Kamal from the ILO. I'm now turning to my co-facilitator, David Vasco from WRI. David, to bring this session to a close, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. And let me just briefly say thank you to all the panelists for all of their excellent and interesting remarks. And I think we see both the ways in which we've had a growth over the years in the degree to which countries are addressing just transition in their NDCs, but also the path forward and countries' intent to broaden and deepen their work to address just transition in the NDCs, and also the ways in which many countries may be able to go about doing so. So it's been a terrific session. I've learned a lot. I hope that all of you have as well. So let me close simply by thanking the NDC Partnership and our partners in pulling this webinar together, Mustafa for his excellent moderation. And there's obviously much more to discuss. We hope that the conversation will continue. And thank you all so much for being part of this event today.
Thank you, everyone. And if you have just a second, we've launched another poll to see if you have gained some additional knowledge about the topic of just transition, and we would appreciate your feedback there.
Yeah, and David, I'm asking if panelists are still online to just turn on their cameras, maybe take a screenshot to share. Please, thank you.